9 years. Alara Quinn vanished without a trace, leaving Kieran Vale with a broken heart and a lonely empire. Now she stands behind the coffee counter, trembling each morning as the city's most powerful man walks through the door, as if cruel fate is testing her limits. But this morning is different. This morning, a child stands outside in the cold, clutching the silver pendant, the Vale family's only treasure, and Kieran sees those familiar, heartbreakingly cold gray eyes. 9 years' secret is about to explode. If you're reading this story, hit like and comment your city name below so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything. The coffee shop had no name worth remembering. That was the first thing Kieran Vale had noticed about it 3 months ago, when his driver had taken a wrong turn through the older part of the city and Kieran had stepped out into the cold because he needed air more than he needed to be on time. The sign above the door was sun-bleached to near illegibility, the awning a faded green that had probably once been something cheerful. The neighborhood was the kind that got described in city planning documents as transitional, which meant it had been forgotten long enough that the forgetting had become architectural. He had gone in for coffee. He had come back every morning since. He told himself it was the coffee. The coffee was, in fact, exceptional, dark and slightly bitter, with that particular weight that came from beans roasted by someone who cared more about the result than the marketing. He had tried to find out where they sourced it. The woman behind the counter had looked at him with flat brown eyes and said, "Guatemala," and gone back to work. He had not asked again. What he did instead was come back. 6:15 every morning, before the financial district woke up, before the Vale Global building filled with people who needed things from him. He would sit at the corner table with the wobbly leg. He had learned to compensate without thinking about it. And he would drink his coffee and read the overnight reports from Singapore and try not to watch her. He was rarely successful at the last part. Her name was Alara Quinn. He knew this because he had seen it on a piece of mail sitting beside the register on his third visit, a water bill with a handwritten correction to the address. And the name had stopped him so completely that he had spilled his coffee and she had brought him napkins without meeting his eyes, and he had sat for 20 minutes after she turned away, just breathing. Alara Quinn. Not a common name, but he had known an Alara once, 9 years ago, when he was 28 and building the first real version of himself, and she was 25 and studying structural architecture, and they had met at a municipal fundraiser where neither of them had wanted to be, and had ended up standing outside in the cold for 2 hours talking about buildings. What made a structure hold? What made it fail? He had fallen in love with her in approximately 6 weeks, which was not something Kieran Vale did. He did not fall. He calculated, he assessed, he made decisions with their attendant risks clearly mapped. But Alara had been outside his models. She laughed at things that weren't meant to be funny, and she made terrible decisions about food combinations. And she argued with him about city infrastructure at 11 o'clock at night with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, and he had stopped calculating somewhere around week 4 and just let it happen. She had left in month 7. No letter, no call. Her apartment cleared out, her phone disconnected, her name removed from the university enrollment. His investigator had found exactly nothing, which should have been impossible and wasn't. And after 8 months of searching, Kieran had done the thing he was best at, which was to put the loss in a compartment and seal it and keep building. The woman behind the counter of this nameless coffee shop moved like Alara moved. She held her shoulders the same way, a slight forward tilt like she was always bracing for something. She had the same hands, long-fingered, quick, a small scar at the base of the left thumb that Kieran remembered because she had gotten it on a broken coffee mug at his apartment, and he had wrapped it with a dish towel and held it too long, and she had laughed at him for being dramatic. He had not asked her name directly. He had waited for the water bill. He had spent 3 weeks telling himself there were thousands of women with similar posture and similar hands, and that grief did strange things to pattern recognition. He had sat at his wobbly corner table and watched her, and told himself he was being irrational. Then one morning she had reached across the counter to hand him his cup, and the cuff of her sleeve had pulled back and he had seen it, a small tattoo on the inside of her left wrist, 3 geometric lines intersecting at a single point. The same tattoo she had gotten on a Tuesday in March 9 years ago while he sat in the parlor, waiting and pretending to read a magazine. After that, he stopped telling himself anything. She knew who he was. He was certain of that. Kieran Vale's face appeared in enough business publications and financial news broadcasts that remaining unaware of him required effort, and she was making that effort visibly, deliberately. The way she never quite looked at him directly, the way she moved to the far end of the counter when he came in, the way she kept the transactions quick and professional and utterly without warmth. She was performing not knowing him, and she was doing it well enough that anyone who didn't have the original to compare it to would have been convinced. He let it run. He didn't know why exactly. Some instinct that told him pushing would break whatever fragile thing was currently holding them in the same room. So he came in every morning and ordered his coffee and sat at the corner table and waited for something he couldn't name. On a Tuesday in November, with a thin, freezing rain coming off the river and the morning sky the color of old concrete, he came in and ordered and took his table and looked up from his reports to find a child standing outside the glass door. The boy was 7, maybe 8. He was wearing a dark coat that fit properly. Someone cared about how he dressed. And he had a backpack on one shoulder, and he was standing very still in the rain with the patient stillness of a child who had been told to wait and had decided to take the instructions seriously. His hair was dark. His posture was upright in a way that was unusual for children who tended toward slouch and fidget. Kieran looked at the boy and felt something shift in his chest. He couldn't have said what it was. Something structural. Something in the load-bearing walls. The boy's face was turned slightly away, watching something down the street, and then he turned and his eyes met Kieran's through the glass, and Kieran felt the room tilt. The eyes were gray. Not hazel, not blue-gray, not the ambiguous middle ground that got called gray by people being approximate. They were gray the way certain winter skies were gray, clear and cold and without compromise. Kieran had seen eyes that color in exactly 2 places in his life. In the mirror every morning and in photographs of his father and his father's father and the long, unbroken line of Vale men whose portraits lined the east corridor of the family compound in Connecticut. He was looking at those eyes in the face of a child he had never seen before. And his mind, the mind that had built 3 successful companies and navigated 2 federal investigations and restructured a $1 billion portfolio in 48 hours during a market collapse, went completely, utterly quiet. Alara came out from the back with a clean apron and stopped when she saw where he was looking. The color in her face changed. Not much, just enough. The boy pushed through the door, shaking rain off his shoulders, and said, "Mom, the bus was early, so I had to walk from Alderton Street, and my shoes are wet," in the pragmatic, slightly aggrieved tone of a child reporting a logistical problem rather than complaining. Alara was beside him in 4 steps. "Come here." She crouched and unzipped his backpack and found dry socks from some internal pocket with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, who had prepared for exactly this contingency. "Sit down. Take those off." "I'm fine." "Kaylin." The boy sat down and changed his socks without further argument. Kieran had not moved. He was still holding his coffee cup, and his cup was still full, and the reports on his tablet were still open to a shipping logistics summary from Jakarta, and none of it was registering. He was watching the boy's hands, the way they moved, the way the fingers were long, and the movements were precise, and he was watching his face, and he was understanding something that rewrote every assumption he had held for the last 9 years. Alara stood up. She did not look at Kieran. "Kaylin, go wait in the back for 10 minutes, then I'll walk you to school." "You don't have to walk me. I know the way." 10 minutes. Her voice was steady. Kieran recognized the steadiness as the same one she used when she was most afraid. The boy went. He gave Kieran one more look on the way. Direct, assessing, the same look Kieran gave rooms when he entered them, cataloging exits and power dynamics, and then disappeared through the back door. The shop was empty except for the 2 of them. Alara stood at the counter with her back to him. Her hands were on the edge of the wood, and she was very still. Kieran set his cup down. "How old is he?" he said. "Don't." "Alara." She turned around then. Her face was composed in the way faces got when the composure was the only thing left. Her eyes were dry, and her jaw was set, and she looked at him like she had been rehearsing this moment, and had decided there was no version of it that didn't hurt and had made her peace with the hurting. "He's 8, she said. The arithmetic was simple. The arithmetic was devastating. When were you going to tell me? I wasn't. He should have been angry. Part of him was a cold, deep anger that had no immediate outlet and was going to need somewhere to go eventually. But under the anger was something else, something he didn't have a clean name for, a kind of foundational disorientation, the feeling of a man who has been building on a map that turned out to be wrong. He has my eyes, Kieran said. Yes. He has the veil eyes. My father had them. My grandfather. I know. Alara, I can't do this right now. She looked toward the back. He has school. Then after school. Kieran, after school, he said again, quiet and absolute. You owe me that much. You owe him that much. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not softness, exactly, but the absence of the wall, just for a second. 7 o'clock, she said. Come to the back door, not the front. He nodded. She went to get Kaylin. Kieran sat at his wobbly table and watched the rain and did not open his reports again. He spent the day in meetings and registered almost nothing that was said in them. His assistant, Marcus, had been with him for 6 years and had developed a talent for reading the texture of his silences. By the third meeting, Marcus was handling 90% of the talking, which was technically his job anyway, and Kieran sat at the head of the conference table and let the numbers and projections wash past him and thought about gray eyes. He had done the calculation. He had then done it again, slowly, and then a third time with different assumptions to see if a different answer was possible. It wasn't. If the boy was 8, and there was no reason for Alara to lie about that, lying about it would only shorten the runway on the truth, then he had been conceived in the last months of what Kieran had known as their relationship. He had been conceived and Alara had known, and she had left anyway. She had left knowing she was carrying his child. He thought about that for the full duration of a 40-minute presentation on third-quarter growth projections for the Vail Global Asia-Pacific Division. He thought about it while his CFO walked him through a restructuring proposal that was going to require his personal sign-off. He thought about it in the car on the way back east across the city as the rain turned to sleet and the streetlights smeared in the windows. She had left knowing. That was the part that didn't fit any model he had. The Alara he had known. The one who argued about infrastructure at 11 p.m., who laughed at the wrong things, who held her coffee cup with both hands and talked with her whole body. That woman would not have done that. He had been wrong about things in his life, badly wrong sometimes. Wrong in ways that had cost him money and time, and in 2 cases, relationships he valued. But he had not been wrong about her fundamental nature. He couldn't have been that wrong, which meant something else had happened. Something that had made leaving look better than staying, safer than staying, not just for her, but for the child. He turned that over in his mind and felt a different kind of cold settle in. The back door of the coffee shop opened onto a narrow alley between brick buildings, lit by a single overhead lamp that was losing its argument with the dark. Kieran came at 7 exactly. He had changed out of his suit, which felt like the right choice without being able to articulate why. Like showing up in full corporate armor would be the wrong kind of statement. Alara opened the door before he knocked. She had changed too. She was wearing a dark sweater and jeans, and she looked like herself in a way that the counter version didn't, less defended, or defended differently. She let him in without speaking. The back of the shop was small, a storeroom converted into something that was half office, half living space, a folding table and 2 mismatched chairs, and a small lamp and shelves of inventory along one wall. There was a closed door on the far side. He's asleep, Alara said. I'm not here to see him tonight. She looked at him. Okay. I'm here because I want to understand. She sat down at the folding table and put her hands flat on it, a gesture he recognized as her version of preparing. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sleet was audible on the roof, a dry hiss. You were pregnant when you left, he said. Yes. You knew. I had known for 3 weeks. And you chose not to tell me. Her jaw tightened. I chose to keep you alive. Those 2 things don't have to be in the same category. He watched her face. What does that mean? Alara looked at her hands. Then she looked at him, and something in the way she did it, the flatness of it, the exhaustion behind the flatness, told him she had been waiting to say this for a very long time and had stopped hoping it would ever happen. "Do you remember Marcus Aldrin?" she said. He did. A lawyer, peripherally connected to Vale Global's early financing. He had left the company under murky circumstances when Kieran was 26, 2 years before Kieran took control of the business entirely. "What about him?" "He came to see me," Alara said. "It was February. You had just gotten back from the Singapore deal. He came to my apartment with 2 other men, and he told me something about your family." "My family?" "About what your family actually was." She met his eyes. "About what was underneath the legitimate business. The consulting contracts, the fund management, the real estate holdings. What was underneath all of it?" Kieran was very still. "He told me that your father had been running a secondary operation for 30 years. That Vale Global was the clean layer on top of something that was not clean. Money moving through untraceable channels. Influence over politicians in 4 countries. Contracts with people whose business was not the kind that got filed with the SEC." She paused. "He told me they were preparing to transition that operation to you, that whether you knew it yet or not, you were going to inherit it." "I didn't know any of that," Kieran said. "I know." "Then why?" "Because they knew about us." Her voice was steady, and it cost her something to keep it that way. "They knew about me. And they told me that if I stayed, if I became part of your life in a formal way, if you chose me over the transition, if you pushed back on what they were building you to become, there were people who would use me to control you, or remove me." He was very specific about what remove meant. The cold in Kieran's chest spread outward. "And you were pregnant. And I was pregnant." She said it simply, like it was just information. "I couldn't go to you. If I told you, you would have fought. That's what you do. It's what I loved about you. You don't retreat from things. But they weren't people you could fight at 28 with the company half built and no idea who you were actually dealing with. They would have killed you. They told me they would, and I believed them, and I was right to believe them because 2 years later a man named Hector Vane found out what your family actually was, and he ended up at the bottom of a parking structure in Baltimore." Kieran knew the name. He had been told it was a mugging. "So you left." "I took nothing that could be traced. New city, new name on everything except the things that couldn't be changed. I was very careful." "For 8 years." "For 8 years." He looked at the closed door. "Does he know anything?" "He knows his father's name. He knows you exist. I told him you didn't know about him, which was true, and that it was complicated, which is also true." Something moved in her face. "He asked me once if you would ever come find us, and I told him I didn't know." "He waited outside in the rain this morning," Kieran said. "He stood there and waited, and he didn't complain. He does that. He's very self-contained for his age. Sometimes it worries me." She looked down. "He's like you in more ways than just the eyes." Kieran's throat was tight. He pushed past it. "The pendant," he said. "The silver one he was holding this morning. Where did he get it?" Alara went quiet. A different kind of quiet. The kind that preceded something significant. "I gave it to him," she said. "About 2 months ago." "Where did you get it?" "It came in the mail." She looked at him steadily. No return address. Just the pendant wrapped in cloth and a note with 3 words. "What 3 words?" "They found you." Kieran sat with that for 3 seconds. In 3 seconds, he did a great deal of processing. "Who sent it?" he said. "I don't know, but someone knew where I was. Knew about Kaylin. Sent the veil crest to my door to tell me the protection I'd bought 8 years ago was finished." She was still steady, but her hands had closed into fists on the table. "I've been trying to figure out what to do. I've been trying to figure out if moving is fast enough, if there's anywhere far enough. I've been running out of options." "How long ago did it arrive?" 6 weeks? 6 weeks. He did the calculation on that too. "And I walked into your shop 3 months ago." "Yes." "And you served me coffee and said nothing." "What was I supposed to say?" For the first time, her voice had an edge to it, not anger exactly, but the strain behind the steadiness finally showing. "Hello, welcome back, by the way. You have a son, and the people who've been hunting us for 8 years just found us. I didn't know if you were part of it. I didn't know if you coming in every morning was a coincidence, or if they sent you or us. Alara. I know. She exhaled. I know. I watched you for 3 months, and I know it's not that. But I needed to be certain. And now you're certain. And now you know about Kaylin, which takes the choice out of my hands. She looked at him with something exhausted and unguarded and real. So here we are. Here we are, he agreed. Outside, the sleet had shifted back to rain. Kieran thought about the pendant, a Vale family piece, one of a limited number made at the end of the 19th century, given only to blood members of the line. He thought about someone who knew what it was, who had one, who had sent it to Alara Quinn's door in this unnamed coffee shop in this forgotten neighborhood 6 weeks ago as a message that the timeline was closing. He thought about a boy standing in freezing rain with patient gray eyes, holding that pendant. He thought about everything he had not known about his own family, everything that had apparently been built in the dark beneath the thing he thought he was inheriting. I'm going to need names, he said. Everyone Aldrin mentioned to you, everything you remember from that conversation 8 years ago. Kieran, I have resources now that I didn't have at 28. Different resources. He looked at her. I'm not going to let them have him. Alara looked at him for a long time. Her face in the lamplight was older than the face he remembered, and more certain, and more tired, and still completely, devastatingly, the face he had never fully let go of. If you do this, she said quietly, there's no clean exit on the other side. You understand that. Once you know what they are, once you start looking, you become a threat to them. I already am, he said. I have been since the day I was born. I just didn't know it. She held his gaze. Then she nodded, once, slow. I'll write down everything I remember, she said. Good. He stood. She stood. For a moment they were close enough that he could see the small scar at the base of her left thumb, the one she had gotten on his broken coffee mug, the one that had been there when she left and was still there now. I'm sorry I didn't trust you with this earlier, she said. You were keeping him alive, Kieran said. That's the one thing I can't argue with. He moved toward the door, stopped. What's he like, he said, when he's not waiting in the rain? Something happened in Alara's face that was not quite a smile but was close to one, something soft and tired and real. He takes things apart to see how they work, she said. Clocks, electronics, anything he can get his hands on. He always puts them back together correctly. He's never broken anything that wasn't already broken. A pause. He's been asking about structural engineering lately. Why buildings hold. Kieran stood in the doorway of a storage room above an alley in the rain and felt the particular weight of things that happened to you before you were ready for them. I'll be back tomorrow morning, he said. 7 o'clock. He'll be awake by then. Good. He stepped out into the alley and the door closed behind him and the rain came down steady and cold, and he stood in it for a moment, letting it hit. Somewhere in the city, someone had sent a veil pendant to a woman who had been hiding for 8 years to tell her that her cover was gone. Somewhere in the city, an organization that had been running beneath his family's name for 30 years, an organization that had threatened the woman he loved into vanishing rather than risk what knowing her might cost him, was already moving. And now they knew about Kaylin. He pulled out his phone and called the one number he used for things that couldn't go through Vale Global's official channels. It rang twice. It's me, he said. I need a full security sweep of a location tonight, and I need everything you can find on a man named Marcus Aldrin, current whereabouts, current affiliations. Whatever he's connected to now, he paused, and pull everything we have on my father's financial history from 1987 onward, the parts that weren't in the official records. A pause on the other end. That's a wide aperture, the voice said. I know what it is, Kieran said. Do it. He ended the call and stood in the rain and looked up at the narrow strip of sky between the buildings, black and wet and pressing down. Tomorrow morning, a boy with gray eyes and his father's posture was going to wake up and go to school, not knowing that the inheritance he carried in his blood had just become a target. Not knowing that the careful, quiet life his mother had built him was already beginning to crack at the edges. Kieran put the phone away. He had spent 9 years building an empire on a map that turned out to be wrong. It was time to find out what the real map looked like, before someone else used it to take everything that was left. Kieran came back at 7 the next morning, like he said he would. He had not slept. He had spent the night in the secure office on the 41st floor of Vale Global, the one with the signal blockers and the shredder built into the desk, going through everything his contact Nolan had been able to pull in 6 hours. It was not everything. It was enough to make him understand that everything was going to be considerably worse than he had initially framed it. His father, Edmund Vale, had died 4 years ago of a cardiac event at his Connecticut estate. The obituaries had been respectful. The tributes from the financial community had been numerous. Kieran had stood at the grave in November rain and felt the complicated thing that sons feel when they bury difficult fathers, and had thought he was done with Edmund Vale's legacy in any meaningful sense. He had been wrong about that in ways that were still coming into focus. What Nolan had found in 6 hours was the edge of something very large. Shell companies nested inside other shell companies, a structure so deliberately convoluted that even forensic accounting would take months to fully map. Financial flows moving through jurisdictions chosen specifically for their opacity. And names, not many, not yet, but enough. A private security contractor based out of Vienna, a logistics company in Rotterdam that appeared in the background of 3 federal investigations without ever being charged. A man named Cassius Vrel, who had no public profile whatsoever, which was itself a kind of profile. Kieran had looked at what 9 years of careful digging had not found and understood why Alara had run. He parked 2 blocks from the shop and walked in the cold with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds, and thought about what he was going to say to a boy he had never spoken to before today. Kalen was already at the counter eating toast when Kieran came through the back door. He looked up from his toast with the gray eyes and the assessing calm and said, "You're the man from the corner table." "Yes. Mom told me your name." "Did she?" "Kieran Vale." The boy said it the way children said things they had practiced, carefully, without effect. "She said you knew each other a long time ago." "We did." Kalen looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at his toast. "She also said you're my father." Kieran stood in the doorway of that small back room and felt the sentence land in him like something physical. He had known it was coming. The knowing did not make it smaller. "That's right," he said. "Okay," Kalen said. "Just that." "Okay." He picked up his toast and took a bite and chewed with the methodical focus of someone who had decided to process information privately and would report back when he was ready. Kieran recognized the mechanism because he used it himself. Alara came in from the shop floor wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked at Kieran first, checking something in his face, then at Kalen. "Bus in 20 minutes, she said. "I know." "Coat's by the door." "I know, Mom." She poured Kieran a coffee without asking and set it on the folding table and did not pour one for herself. She sat down across from where he was standing and waited. Kalen finished his toast, put his plate in the small sink, shrugged on his coat with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and stopped at the door. He looked at Kieran. "Are you going to be here when I get back?" he asked. Kieran looked at Alara. She gave him nothing. "I'm going to try," he said, which was the only honest answer. Kalen appeared to evaluate this. "Okay," he said again, and went out. The door closed. The room was quiet. "He's not going to be shattered by this," Alara said. "He's resilient, but don't make promises you can't keep." "I said I'd try." "I heard what you said." He sat down. The coffee was the same as always, dark, certain of itself. He drank it and looked at the list on his phone. "I need to go over what you remember from the Aldrin conversation," he said. "Everything. Names, locations, anything specific." "I told you most of it last night." "You told me the shape of it. I need the texture." He looked up. "Who were the 2 men who came with him?" She folded her arms, not defensively, just like she was holding herself together by the seams. "One was tall, Eastern European accent, didn't speak. The other one spoke but never gave a name. Mid-50s, gray at the temples. He had a scar through his left eyebrow." Kieran typed it in. What did they say about the transition? Specific words. Aldrin said, he said it like it was fact, no negotiation, that your father had been in the process of transferring operational control for 3 years, that you were being prepared, that by the time you were 30, the transition would be complete, whether you cooperated or not, because the infrastructure was already being built around you, around me, around Vale Global. The legitimate company was the architecture. The real operation ran through the same channels, same lawyers, same financial institutions, same international contacts. You couldn't separate them. Kieran sat with that. He had spent years building Vale Global. He had thought he was building something clean. Apparently, he had been building a housing for something else entirely, guided by advisors and partners and board members his father had placed with a patience and a purpose Kieran had taken for normal corporate governance. Did Aldrin say who was at the top of the operation? He said. He said your father answered to a group, not an individual, a group. She looked at her hands. He called them the Charter. He said they were 7 individuals with combined assets in the hundreds of billions, combined political influence across 12 countries. He said your father's position in the Charter was hereditary, that the Vale seat had passed from father to son for 2 generations, and that it was going to pass to you. 2 generations, Kieran said. My grandfather. Yes. He thought about the portraits in the East Corridor, the steady gray eyes looking down. And Kaylin, he said. Alara's jaw tightened. Aldrin said something at the end, before they left. He said that bloodline was the only non-negotiable element. That leadership could be managed, could be shaped, could be removed if necessary. But bloodline was the authentication. Without it, certain parts of the operation couldn't be accessed. Financial structures, legal arrangements, things that were built to respond only to verified Vale genetics. She looked at him. He said that's why I had to go quietly. If I stayed, if we had children, if there was another generation of Vale blood outside the Charter's control, they'd want to control it, Kieran said. Or eliminate it. He put the phone down and looked at the wall. 8 years ago, Alara had been a 25-year-old woman with no resources and no allies, and men in her apartment telling her that the child she was carrying was either an asset to be controlled or a liability to be removed. She had done the only thing available to her. She had disappeared. The pendant, he said, the one Kaylin had. It's a Vale authentication piece, 19th century, given only to blood members. There were 12 made originally. I know where 10 of them are. My father had 2. One is in the estate inventory, which I control. The other... He stopped. The other one came to my door, Alara said quietly. Someone in the Charter sent it. Someone who knew what it was, knew what it meant, knew your address. He picked up the phone again. That's not just a warning. That's a demonstration. They're showing you they can reach you. They're showing you the clock has run out. I know what it is. Then you know we can't stay in this building. The silence that followed had weight. This is my life, Alara said, not as an argument, as a statement of something she needed to say before she let it go. I built this. The shop, the neighborhood, the routine. Kaylin has school here. He has a friend down the street, a boy named Danny. They take apart electronics together on Saturdays. He has a life here. I know. I'm not saying we don't move. I'm saying I need you to understand what it costs before you make the operational decision. Kieran met her eyes. I understand what it costs. She held his gaze and then looked away and exhaled slowly. Okay, what do we do? Tonight, after Kaylin is back from school, you pack what you need, 1 bag each. Nothing traceable. No electronics you haven't had for more than 2 years. No. The back door opened. Kieran was on his feet before it fully swung. The man who came through was not an assassin. He was mid-30s, light jacket, jeans, the particular kind of nondescript that was its own kind of flag. He held both hands away from his body. I'm not armed, he said immediately. Who are you? Kieran said. My name is Devlin Marsh. I work for a woman named Sarah Calloway. You don't know her name, but she knows yours. She's been tracking the Charter's activity for 4 years, and she's the one who sent the pendant. Alara was standing against the far wall. Kieran could see her in his peripheral vision, absolutely still. That's a lot to come through someone's back door with, Kieran said. I know. I'm sorry for the approach. Direct contact through normal channels isn't possible. The charter monitors your professional communications. We've known your shop was being watched for 3 weeks. He said this to Alara. There's a man in the apartment building across the alley. 3rd floor, window facing this direction. He's been there since the pendant arrived. The cold in Kieran's chest moved. He did not look at the window. Talk, he said to Marsh. Devlin Marsh talked. Sarah Calloway had been a federal financial crimes investigator until 5 years ago, when a case she was building against a Vienna-based security contractor had resulted in 2 of her colleagues dying in a car accident that wasn't one. She had resigned, gone private, and spent the years since building the most complete independent dossier on the charter's operation that existed outside the charter itself. She had sources inside 3 of the charter's financial institutions. She had documentation of 43 separate incidents of what could legally be called treason across 4 countries. What she did not have was the authentication key that would allow access to the charter's primary data architecture, the encrypted financial and operational records that would make the documentation actionable in any court. The authentication key was biological. Vale blood, Kieran said. Specifically, a 2nd-generation Vale descendant. Your father was the primary key. You are the secondary. Kalen? Marsh stopped. Say it, Kieran said. Kalen is a tertiary key that the system recognizes as primary because your father coded it that way before he died. We think he did it intentionally. We think Edmund Vale spent the last 2 years of his life trying to find a way out of the charter that he'd helped build, and Kalen was his exit architecture. Alara made a sound, just one small sound. Then she was quiet again. Edmund Vale knew about Kalen, Kieran said. He found out approximately 3 years before he died. We're not certain how, but yes, he knew. And instead of reporting Kalen's existence to the charter, he modified the authentication system to make the boy the key that could unlock everything. Marsh looked between them. Which means the charter, when they figure this out, and they're close to figuring it out, won't just want to control Kalen. They'll want to use him to access their own records and then eliminate everyone who knows what those records contain. The room was very quiet. Outside in the alley, rain had started again, light and persistent. Why come to us now? Kieran said. If you've been watching for 3 weeks, why now? Marsh reached into his jacket, slowly, watching Kieran's hands, and put a folded photograph on the table. Kieran looked at it. It was a surveillance image, time-stamped 48 hours ago, showing a man getting out of a car 2 streets from the coffee shop. The man was mid-50s, gray at the temples, a scar through his left eyebrow. Alara looked at the photograph and said, very quietly, "That's him. That's the man who came with Aldrin." "His name is Rourke Ceylon," Marsh said. "He's the charter's operational director. He doesn't deploy personally unless the situation has moved past the intelligence phase." He paused. "He was in this neighborhood 2 days ago. He will be back." Kieran looked at the photograph for another 3 seconds. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket. "How do we contact Calloway?" he said. The contact instructions Marsh had left were careful. A specific payphone 6 blocks away, a time window, a code phrase. Kieran spent 2 hours after Marsh left verifying what he could of Sarah Calloway's existence through Nolan, working from the periphery inward. Former federal investigator, the resignation confirmed, 2 colleagues dead in the same 6-month window, her name appearing in the margins of 3 separate cases that had gone cold in ways that cold cases didn't usually go cold. She was real. Marsh was real. The question of whether their interests aligned was going to remain open longer than Kieran would have liked. He was at the payphone at the designated time. The call connected after 1 ring. "I've confirmed enough of what your man told me to have this conversation," Kieran said. "I haven't confirmed enough to trust you." "That's reasonable." The voice was a woman's, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone who had trained the expressiveness out of her communication. "What do you need?" "I need to know what you want from us." "Access to the authentication system, not Kalen himself. We'd never put a child in operational range of anything, but the genetic verification can be done remotely with a biological sample and the correct interface. We've built the interface. We need the sample. And after you have it, we transmit everything to 6 simultaneous recipients, 3 federal agencies across 2 countries, 2 international financial oversight bodies, and a journalist whose work I trust. The charter's architecture collapses within 72 hours. Most of the key figures are arrested or flee to jurisdictions that won't extradite, but either way they lose the infrastructure. And Veil Global. A pause. Veil Global is extensively documented in what we have. I won't lie to you about that. There will be an investigation. The legitimate operations, the parts you built, will likely survive it. The parts your father built around them won't. He had known this was coming since last night, knowing it was still a particular kind of loss. What about security for Alara and Kaylin during the window between now and the transmission? He said. We have a safe house. We'd want them moved within... No, Kieran said. They stay with me. My security, my protocols. You get the sample and you get cooperation. You don't get physical custody of my son. Another pause, longer. Agreed, Calloway said. He hung up the phone and stood on the sidewalk with the rain coming down and thought about the word my, which he had just used without calculation for the first time in his life in relation to a child. He came back to the shop at 4 o'clock, which was when Kaylin got back from school. He was not prepared for what that actually looked like. The boy coming through the front door with his backpack and his wet shoes and going straight to the back, and Alara already having his after-school routine in place without thinking about it. A glass of juice and a specific spot at the folding table and the unspoken rhythms of 8 years of just the two of them. Kieran sat to the side and watched and felt like an intruder in his own story. Kaylin got his juice and sat down and looked at Kieran. You stayed, he said. I said I'd try. Yeah. The boy appeared to regard this as sufficient. He unzipped his backpack and produced a small mechanical alarm clock, the old-fashioned kind with 2 bells on top, gutted and partially reassembled, and set it on the table and went back to work. What's wrong with it? Kieran said. The escapement mechanism is slightly bent. It makes the seconds uneven. He didn't look up. I'm trying to straighten it without removing the mainspring because last time I removed a mainspring, it took me 3 hours to get the tension right. If you angle the... Kieran stopped himself. Kaylin looked up. What? If you angle the adjustment tool at about 30 degrees instead of straight on, you get more leverage without torquing the housing. The boy considered this. Then he adjusted his approach and tried it. The mechanism clicked, settled, ticked evenly. Kaylin looked at the clock for a moment, then he looked at Kieran with the gray eyes and said nothing, but something in the assessment shifted. Some small door opening a fraction. Alara was watching from across the room. She had her arms folded and her face was doing something complicated and private. Pack tonight, Kieran told her. His voice was low, meant only for her. After he's in bed. We move tomorrow morning. She nodded. Kaylin was winding the clock, listening to it tick, his head tilted at the angle of someone checking their own work. Kieran looked at his son and felt the wall he had built around the loss 9 years ago develop a crack he was not going to be able to repair. He was not sure he wanted to. Well, he left at 6 and came back at 9 with Nolan and 2 other men he trusted in ways that had been tested. They swept the building, quietly, professionally, Alara watching with her arms folded and her face doing nothing, and confirmed what Marsh had told them. The window across the alley, 3rd floor, had been occupied. The man was gone now. Had been gone since that afternoon. That was worse, in its way, than if he'd still been there. Nolan pulled Kieran aside in the alley. They've made us, Nolan said. The sweep on the shop, the contact with Marsh. Someone in the charter's network flagged it. We got a tripwire notification from a monitored server. They know you've been here. How long do we have? Hours. Maybe less. Kieran looked at the back door of the coffee shop. Through it, somewhere past the storeroom and the folding table, a boy with his eyes was sleeping in a bed his mother had built him in a life she had built out of nothing, with no margin for error and no backup, and nothing to rely on but herself for 8 years. Get the car, he said. I'm going in to get them now. He pushed through the door and took the 4 steps to the closed interior door and knocked. Alara opened it in 10 seconds. She was dressed. She had the bag already in her hand. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. "I packed 2 hours ago," she said simply. "I know how this works." Behind her, Kalen was sitting on the edge of his bed in his coat with his backpack on, the alarm clock tucked inside, awake and calm with the ancient patience of a child who has learned that night departures are part of the architecture of his life. He looked at Kieran. "Are we leaving now?" he asked. "Yes," Kieran said. "Okay," Kalen said, and stood up. They went out into the alley and into the car, and the city moved past the windows in streaks of wet light, and Kieran sat in the front and watched the mirrors and said nothing, and thought about Rourke's cell-in, in a surveillance photo 2 days old, and the word hours and the weight of what it meant that a man like that had come personally to this neighborhood. They were 4 blocks from the safe house Kieran had arranged, a secured apartment in a building his holding company owned, not officially connected to Vale Global, the kind of address that wouldn't appear in the first 3 layers of any search. When the traffic light ahead turned red and the car stopped and Nolan said, very quietly, "Don't react." In the side mirror, 2 cars back, a dark SUV had stopped. It had stopped at an odd angle, the kind of angle that left it pointed at them. Kalen was looking out the window at the wet street, his reflection ghosted in the glass, calm and still. Alara had seen it too. Her hand had found Kieran's arm in the dark between the seats and closed around it, not in fear exactly, in readiness. The light turned green. Nolan drove. The SUV moved with them, and Kieran understood in the way he understood structural failures, not as a possibility, but as a fact already in progress. That the careful, strategic, measured approach he had been building toward was not going to be how this went. They were already in it, and the only direction left was through. Nolan took a left on Carver Street without signaling, a sharp cut that bought them half a block of separation. The SUV followed, no hesitation. Whoever was driving knew the city or had navigation support, and either way, it meant they weren't going to lose them through improvisation alone. "Second car," said one of Nolan's men from the rear seat. "Blue sedan parallel on Merchant." They had 2. "Kalen," Alara said, her voice even, "get down on the floor." The boy didn't argue. He was on the floor of the back seat in 3 seconds, backpack pulled over his head with the instinctive practicality of a child who had been drilled for exactly this without ever being told why. Kieran turned to Nolan. "The warehouse on Fell Street. Calloway's team has a staging point 2 blocks east of it. Get us there." "That's 12 minutes. Make it 8. Nolan made a call. 1 word. The address. Then he ran the next red light at 40 miles an hour, and the city blurred, and the SUV behind them ran it too, and the blue sedan on Merchant disappeared from view, which meant it was repositioning, trying to cut the angle, trying to box them before they could reach anything that looked like safety. Alara had her hand on Kalen's back. She was not looking out the windows. She was looking at the back of Kieran's head with an expression he couldn't see but could feel, something that had been held in for 8 years beginning very slowly to let go. Nolan took 3 more turns in rapid succession, dropped into a service lane behind a row of warehouses, killed the headlights for 30 seconds while they rolled through the dark, then brought them back up on a different street entirely. The SUV was gone from the mirror. The blue sedan was not. 50 meters, the man in the back said. Close enough, Nolan said, and pulled hard into a loading bay where 2 men with Calloway's build and bearing were already pulling open a side door. The car stopped. The doors opened. Kieran was out first. He opened Kalen's door himself, and the boy unfolded from the floor with dirt on his knees and his jaw set at an angle that was going to break Kieran's heart every time he saw it for the rest of his life. They went through the door, and it closed behind them, and the locks engaged, and the dark outside swallowed the sound of the blue sedan rolling past without stopping. Alara exhaled once, sharp and short. Then she straightened. Kalen looked up at Kieran. His eyes were steady and gray and dry. "Are they going to find us here?" he asked. Kieran crouched to his level. "Not tonight," he said. The boy held his gaze and nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone filing the answer away, reserving judgment on whether it would still be true by morning. He was 8 years old and he already knew how to do that. Kieran stood up and looked at Alara, and they both understood, without saying it, that the life they had each been living separately, the one she had built from nothing, the one he had built on a false map, was finished now, completely and without the possibility of return. What came next was going to be something else entirely. The staging point smelled like machine oil and cold concrete, the kind of smell that belonged to buildings that had been used for practical things and didn't apologize for it. There were 6 of Calloway's people inside, 4 men, 2 women, all with the compact efficiency of former law enforcement or military, the kind of people who moved through rooms without bumping into things and kept their hands visible without being told. Sarah Calloway was not what Kieran had built in his head from the phone call. She was 50, maybe 52, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had been weathered into something harder and more specific than it had probably started as. She was wearing a fleece and cargo pants, and she was looking at a wall of monitors when they came in, and she turned around and looked at Kaylin first, not at Kieran, not at Alara, at the boy. She looked at him for 3 seconds with an expression that was not warmth, but was not its absence either, something clinical shading into something almost like relief. Then she looked at Kieran. "You made it without contact," she said. "Blue sedan tracked us most of the way. Broke off 2 blocks out. They know the general area. We have maybe 4 hours before they narrow it." She turned to one of her people. "Widen the perimeter sweep. I want eyes on every entry point within 6 blocks. Then back to Kieran. "We need to talk, just us. Whatever you say to me, you say in front of Alara." Calloway assessed this without visible reaction. "Fine. Get the boy settled." One of the women, young, with a quiet face and the kind of patience that was trained rather than natural, had already materialized beside Kaylin with a bottle of water and a question about whether he was hungry. Kaylin looked at his mother. Alara nodded once. The boy went without complaint, dragging his backpack, the reassembled clock inside it ticking in the silence. Calloway led them to a back room divided from the main floor by a partition wall, a folding table, and 3 chairs, and a laptop, and nothing else. She sat down and opened the laptop and turned it so they could see the screen. "Before we discuss the authentication protocol," she said, "there's something you need to see." The screen showed a financial document, dense, technical, the kind of formatting that accountants used and everyone else found illegible. Kieran looked at it and started reading and felt the first cold finger of something he didn't immediately name. "What am I looking at?" he said, though he was beginning to know. "Vale Global's secondary architecture, the part your father built around your company." She reached across and scrolled. Specifically, the transfer documents from the last 18 months of Edmund Vale's life, the modifications he made to the authentication system, the ones that made Kaylin the primary key. "You showed me this on the phone. This is the exit architecture. Keep reading." He read. The numbers moved past him in the particular way numbers did when they were telling a story he was reconstructing in real time, not adding up to something new, but revealing something that had been there all along, hidden in the rounding. He stopped at a line item, read it again. "This is a payment," he said. "Yes." "To a holding company in Luxembourg." He looked at the account number. Something in the back of his mind was already working on it, pulling at a thread he couldn't fully see yet. "Dated 14 months ago." "Yes." "That's 8 months after I took full operational control of Vale Global." He looked up. "This came out of accounts I controlled, my signature architecture." "Your signature architecture," Calloway said, "which your father's people had access to for 6 months after his death during the estate transition." "What is this payment for?" Calloway looked at him steadily. "It's a retainer," she said, "to a private security contractor." She scrolled one more line. "The same Vienna-based contractor that has been running surveillance on Alara Quinn's coffee shop for the past 3 weeks." The room went very quiet. Alara was sitting beside him, and he felt her go still in the particular way that meant she was controlling something large. "You're saying someone used my accounts," Kieran said, "to pay the people who are hunting my family." "I'm saying the payment originated from your architecture. Whether you knew about it or not is a question I can't answer from the documents." Calloway paused, and the pause had weight. "But the charter can, and they will use it. If this ever gets in front of a court, The first argument their lawyers make is that Kieran Vale funded the operation himself, that this is internecine, a family power struggle, not an external threat, that you are not a victim of the charter, that you are a participant. Kieran sat with that for the full length of a breath. Someone set this up, he said. Someone set this up very carefully, yes, months in advance. Someone who knew you were going to find out about Kaylin eventually, who knew you would come to us or someone like us, who wanted to make sure that when you did, your credibility was already destroyed. Who? That's the question, isn't it? She closed the laptop. It's someone inside your organization. Someone with access to your financial architecture during the estate transition window. Someone who has been planning for this specific scenario long enough to build a false paper trail before the scenario existed. Alara made a sound. Not a word, just a breath that came out sharp. Nolan, she said. Kieran looked at her. He's been with you 6 years, she said, her voice careful and flat. He handled the estate transition. He had access to everything. She was looking at the table, not at him. He was the one who made the contact call tonight. He's the one who told you the tripwire notification came from a monitored server. She looked up. How do you know the tripwire wasn't meant to push you toward moving before you were ready? Kieran said nothing. How do you know tonight wasn't the plan? He stood up, chair scraping back, and walked to the partition wall and stood with his back to both of them for a moment. His hands were in his pockets and his jaw was tight, and he was doing the thing he did when the map was wrong. Going back to first principles, stripping out every assumption and looking at what was actually there. Nolan had been with him 6 years. He had found Nolan through a referral from a security firm Kieran's father had used. He had thought nothing of that at the time. He thought about it now. Nolan had handled the estate transition, had access to the financial architecture, had been first to suggest the move tonight. Not just first, had framed it as urgent, had set the timeline, had dropped them at the staging point and then gone back out to, what? Manage the perimeter or make a call? Kieran turned around. Where is he now? He said. Calloway was already on her radio. A beat, 2. Then her face changed by a fraction, and that fraction told him everything. He left the perimeter, she said. 8 minutes ago, he told my people he was repositioning the vehicle. He's gone. He's gone. Kieran stood in the small back room of a warehouse 4 hours from dawn, with the paper trail of his own accounts wrapped around his throat like a wire. And the man he had trusted for 6 years somewhere in the city making a phone call. And he understood with the full weight of it that every resource he had spent the last 2 days building toward had just been handed to the people he was building it against. The charter knew where they were. Calloway's staging point was compromised. The safe house he had arranged was burned. Nolan knew that address too. The contact network, the security protocols, the timeline they had been working against, all of it in the hands of Rourke, Sellen, and whoever he answered to. Alara came to stand beside him. She didn't touch him. She just stood there with the particular solidarity of someone who had already survived one version of this and knew what the morning looked like after. How many exits does this building have? Kieran said to Calloway. 4, but how many vehicles? 3. But Kieran, if we run right now, we lose the window for the authentication. The interface I've built requires a stable connection, and at least, if we stay here, we lose Kaylin. He looked at her. Tell me I'm wrong. She didn't. Then we move. Authentication happens when my son is somewhere they can't reach him, not before. He went back through the partition door and into the main staging area. Kaylin was at a side table with the woman who had been watching him, the clock on the table in front of them, the woman watching with the focused patience of someone genuinely interested, while the boy explained the escapement mechanism in the serious technical vocabulary of a child who had taught himself by doing. Kieran crossed the room and crouched down. We're moving again, he said. Kaylin looked at him, no panic, no tears, the gray eyes doing the calculating thing, assembling the information and coming out the other side with a question. Is it the same people from before? Yes. Did someone tell them where we are? Kieran held his son's gaze. Yes. Kaylin nodded slowly, processing it, filing it. Then he picked up the clock and put it in his backpack. Okay, he said. I'm ready. They went out through the east exit into an alley that smelled of standing water and diesel, 3 of Calloway's people ahead and 2 behind, the city still dark and wet and indifferent. They moved fast and low and without speaking. Kieran had one working asset left, a number he had never given to Nolan, a contact he had built before Nolan existed, a man named Garrett Sue who owed him a debt specific enough and large enough that it had never needed to be called in. He called it in from a burner Calloway's people handed him, walking fast through the alley with Alara at his shoulder and Kaylin between them and the buildings on either side pressing close. Garrett answered on the second ring. "I need the Meridian property," Kieran said. "Tonight. Now." A pause, then, "That's a big ask." "You've been holding it for 4 years." "I've been holding it for 4 years," Garrett agreed. "Give me 20 minutes to open the access." "You have 10. He hung up. Alara glanced at him. "What's the Meridian property?" "A building I bought through a holding structure so clean that even Nolan didn't know it existed." He looked ahead. "It's off every map I ever showed him, off every map I ever showed anyone." "For how long?" "Long enough." He watched the end of the alley, the street beyond, the wet geometry of the city that was trying to swallow them. "I bought it 2 years ago. I didn't know why at the time. I just knew it was the kind of asset you wanted to have when everything else was exposed." He paused. "My father taught me that. Keep one thing nobody knows about. Keep it clean. Keep it ready." The irony of using Edmund Vale's wisdom to survive Edmund Vale's legacy was not lost on him. It sat in his chest like a stone. They reached the street. Calloway's lead man held up a fist, and they stopped, pressed against the wall, while he checked the corner. Clear. They moved. Kieran kept his hand near Kaylin's shoulder without touching him, close enough to grab, far enough to let the boy move freely. Kaylin walked with his head up and his steps even. He had not asked how far. He had not asked when it would be over. He was 8 years old and he was walking through a wet city in the middle of the night with people he had met today because men with resources and intent were trying to reach him, and he was handling it with a composure that was going to cost him something later. It always cost something later. But right now it was holding, and it was extraordinary. They were 2 blocks from the extraction point Garrett had given him when Calloway grabbed Kieran's arm. "Wait!" He stopped. She had her earpiece in and her face had changed. "What?" he said. "My asset inside the Charter's financial network just sent an emergency signal." She was listening as she spoke, relaying in real time. "They've moved up the timeline. Whatever they were planning, the extraction, the authentication by force, they've moved it to tonight." She looked at him. "They're not trying to surveil you anymore. They're deploying." "How many?" "My asset says Ceylon left with 8 men 40 minutes ago." She paused. "Armed. 8 men. Rourke Ceylon, personally. 40 minutes ago, which meant Nolan had made his call the moment he cleared the perimeter and Ceylon had mobilized immediately, which meant the staging point had been the target all along, and the only reason they were not already inside it was that Kieran had moved when he did. "They'll be scanning for us," Calloway said. "Facial recognition on street cameras, license plates. The Meridian building has a basement access off the service tunnel," Kieran said. "No street exposure. You need to tell me exactly where that is. I need you to tell me first why I should trust anything coming through your network when Nolan was feeding it for 6 years." The words landed. Calloway's jaw tightened. "Marsh came to you through me," she said. "If I was compromised, you'd have been taken at the shop." Unless taking me at the shop wasn't the plan, unless the plan was to let me run far enough to feel safe and then take Kaylin somewhere with no witnesses. You're describing a level of operational patience that I'm describing exactly what the Charter does. You told me yourself, 30 years of patience, layers of deception, long game architecture. He looked at her. "How long have you been building your dossier?" 4 years. "And in 4 years, you never got close enough to use it. You never found the authentication key. You never made a move." His voice was not raised. It was very quiet. "And then I walked into a coffee shop and sat at a corner table every morning for 3 months. And eventually the pieces fell into place. And here we are. The night everything converges and my most trusted security contact turns out to be a Charter asset." He held her gaze. "So I'm asking you directly, Calloway. Are you the long game? The alley was silent except for the rain and the distant traffic and Kaylin's steady breathing. Calloway looked at him without flinching. No, she said. That's what the long game would say. Yes, she said. It is. I can't prove a negative in an alley at 3 in the morning. What I can tell you is that my 2 colleagues are dead, and I've spent 4 years trying to build something that would mean they didn't die for nothing. And right now, I need you to decide if you're going to trust me or not, because we have maybe 12 minutes before Ceylon's people start covering the grid. Alara put her hand on Kieran's arm. He looked at her. She sent the pendant, Alara said quietly. 8 weeks ago, she sent it. She could have sent something else. She could have sent a team. She sent a warning. She held his gaze. I've been reading people in survival mode for 8 years. Trust her. Kieran looked at Calloway for 3 more seconds. Then he gave her the address. They moved. The service tunnel under the Meridian building was low-ceilinged and smelled of old water and electrical conduit, lit by work lights that Garrett had switched on remotely, throwing everything in flat white. They came through single file. Kaylin first with Alara, then Kieran, then Calloway, and 2 of her people, the rest staying topside for coverage. Garrett Sue met them at the internal door. He was a small, precise man in his late 40s who had made and protected a significant fortune through the specific talent of being underestimated. He looked at the group with the particular calm of a man who had agreed to something large and was going to honor it without drama. 12-hour supply stock, clean comms, no exterior signals, he said to Kieran. You're invisible in here. Thank you. You can thank me when it's over. He looked at Kaylin. Something moved in his face. There's food in the kitchen and a room in the back with a proper bed. Kaylin looked at the room and looked at Kieran. I'm not going to sleep, the boy said. Not defiant, just accurate. Then you don't have to, Kieran said. Garrett took Alara to the supply room to show her the layout. Calloway set up her equipment on the central table. Her 2 people took positions at the monitoring stations Garrett had built into the room years ago for reasons of his own that Kieran had never asked about. Kieran stood in the center of the room and did a full accounting of what he had. He had Alara, he had Kaylin, he had Calloway, and what remained of her network, which was compromised to an unknown degree. He had Garrett and this building, which were clean. He had no security team, no corporate resources, no official channels he could trust. He had a paper trail in his own accounts that made him look like a charter participant. What he did not have. Nolan. The safe house. The security protocols. Any leverage over the charter that didn't require the authentication, and the authentication required a stable window that they didn't currently have. What the charter had, Rourke Ceylon and 8 armed men in the city, Nolan feeding them real-time intelligence, a legal architecture that could bury Kieran in financial fraud charges the moment he surfaced publicly, and 9 years of operational patience. He thought about Edmund Vale modifying the authentication system in the last years of his life. Trying to build an exit, trying to give his grandson a grandson he had discovered and kept secret, the key to dismantle the thing he had spent his life building. He thought about his father's portrait in the East Corridor, the gray eyes looking down. Then Calloway looked up from her equipment with an expression that meant the next thing she said was going to change the shape of the night. I need you to come look at this, she said. He went to the table. On the screen was a live feed. A street camera, the image clean and high resolution and unmistakably showing the exterior of the coffee shop. Alara's coffee shop. The nameless one with the sun-bleached sign. It was on fire. Not dramatically, not the Hollywood version of a building burning, a controlled fire, methodical, moving through the structure with the specific pattern of an accelerant. The kind of fire that sent a message and also destroyed evidence and also ensured that there was nothing left to go back to. Alara had come back into the room. She was standing at Kieran's shoulder and she was looking at the screen and her face had done something he had never seen it do. Not breakdown, not tears, but a terrible, absolute stillness, the expression of a woman watching 8 years of careful survival reduced to smoke and wet ash. Mom, Kaylin's voice, quiet, from behind them both. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the back room, the clock in his hands, watching her face. She crossed to him in 3 steps and pulled him in and held him, and he let her, his arms coming around her waist, his face pressed against her shoulder. Over his head, her eyes found Kieran's, and in them he saw something he recognized because it lived in him too. Not grief, not fear, but the hard and final clarity of a person who has just watched the last option for retreat burn to the ground, who understands now that the only direction is forward, and who is deciding, in this moment, exactly what forward is going to cost. Kieran turned back to the screen. The fire moved through the building with its patient, programmatic logic. The counter where she had served him coffee every morning for 3 months. The corner table with the wobbly leg. The back room where she had kept her life. Gone. He thought about what Calloway had said. The charter was built on the assumption that people would protect themselves first. That survival instinct was the most reliable lever. That everyone eventually could be moved by fear. He thought about Alara standing in the alley 8 years ago, pregnant, alone, threatened by men with resources and intent, and choosing to vanish rather than let fear make her its instrument. He thought about a boy on the floor of a moving car, backpack over his head, not making a sound. He thought about what it meant to be a Veil, what it had meant for 2 generations before him, what it was going to mean now. He pulled out the burner phone. "Calloway," he said, "how long to set up the authentication interface if we start now?" She looked at him. "In this location, with clean comms? 90 minutes. Then start now." "If Selin finds this building during the window, then we have a problem on 2 fronts." He looked at her. "But I'm done waiting for a better moment. The Charter has been waiting 30 years for a better moment. I'm not going to outwait them." He set the phone on the table. "Set it up. We do this tonight." Calloway held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to her equipment and began to work. In the back doorway, Alara had released Kaylin and was looking at Kieran with the flat, clear expression of someone who has made their decision and is not going back on it. She nodded once. He nodded back. The authentication interface began to load on Calloway's screen, and outside in the city, Rourke, Selin, and 8 armed men were moving through the wet grid looking for something they believed they had already cornered, and the clock in Kaylin's backpack ticked on with its newly corrected escapement mechanism, even and precise, each second exactly the weight it was supposed to be. And Kieran Vale, who had spent his entire adult life building on a false map, picked up what was left and began, for the first time, to build something true. The authentication interface took 83 minutes to build, not 90, because Calloway worked with the focused brutality of someone who understood that the difference between 83 and 90 minutes might be the difference between everything and nothing. Kieran watched the progress bars and did not watch them. He moved between the monitoring stations and the central table in the back room where Kaylin had finally, against all stated intentions, fallen asleep on the proper bed with his backpack beside him and one hand resting on the clock even in sleep, fingers loose around the winding key. Alara sat in the chair beside the bed. She was not sleeping. She was watching her son sleep with the specific attention of someone cataloging something they are afraid of losing. Kieran stood in the doorway and looked at both of them and felt the thing in his chest that had no clean name pull tight like a wire under load. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You should too. Someone needs to Calloway has people on the monitors. Garrett is on the perimeter feed." She looked at him. "Sit down, Kieran. You're not going to be useful to anyone when this starts if you haven't stopped moving for 8 hours. He sat in the other chair. The room was small and warm and smelled like dust and Garrett's cleaning products, and under that, faintly, something he recognized as Alara's. The particular soap she used, the same one she'd used 9 years ago, which was either coincidence or loyalty to a detail too small to be strategic. "Tell me about him," Kieran said. "The 8 years. Tell me something I don't know." Alara looked at Kaylin. She was quiet for a moment. "He was 4 when he decided he needed to understand how the electrical system in our apartment worked," she said. "He found the breaker panel and just started tracing circuits. I came home from work and every light switch in the apartment had a piece of masking tape on it with a label he'd written in crayon. Which circuit? Which breaker? What would go dark if it tripped?" She paused. "He was 4. He couldn't spell circuit. He wrote circuit. Kieran looked at his son's sleeping face. He doesn't get scared, Alara said. Or he does, but he converts it into something else immediately. Problem solving. Logistics. She glanced at Kieran. I don't know if that's healthy. I've never known if it's healthy. It's how I work, Kieran said. I know. Her voice was careful. That's why I don't know if it's healthy. He sat with that. It wasn't an attack, it was accurate, and accuracy deserved to be received as such. We're going to get him through this, he said. I know, she said. Not hope. Certainty. The kind built on a foundation of things already survived. He was going to say something else when Calloway appeared in the doorway. We're ready, she said. Mummed. The authentication protocol required 3 things: a biological sample from a verified Vale bloodline member, the interface Calloway had built over 4 years, and an uninterrupted connection of not less than 40 seconds to the Charter's primary data architecture. The sample was a blood draw, 8 milliliters, done by Calloway herself with a field kit. Kieran sat at the table and watched the needle go in and felt nothing about it. Pain was information. This information was minor. Your father built the verification around the 2nd generation rather than the 1st because he knew the Charter would be monitoring his biology, Calloway said as she worked. Any attempt he made to access his own architecture would have been flagged immediately. But Kaylin, a child the Charter didn't officially know existed, could access it without triggering the surveillance protocols. He planned this, Kieran said, from the moment he found out about Kaylin. We think so. We think Edmund Vale spent the last 3 years of his life building an exit that he never got to use himself. Why didn't he come to us directly? Because he didn't know where Alara was. He knew the boy existed, but his own people had hidden Alara too well. They thought they were protecting the Charter's interests by keeping her location from him. She withdrew the needle. The pendant was his. He sent it to her through a back channel his people didn't know about. He died 4 months after he sent it. Kieran thought about his father, the man in the portrait, the man at the grave, the complicated architecture of a person who had built something monstrous and then, at the very end, tried to build a door in it. Is it enough, he said, what you have? If the authentication works, if the records unlock, is it enough to actually end them? Calloway processed the sample through the interface with the careful movements of someone handling something irreplaceable. 7 of the Charter's most senior members. 43 documented incidents across 4 jurisdictions. Financial records that will take forensic accountants 2 years to fully map, but that clearly show $40 billion in illicit flows over 30 years. She looked up. It's enough. Then let's... The monitoring station on the far wall emitted a sharp tone. One of Calloway's people, the young woman from before, turned from the screen with a face that had changed. We have movement, she said. East tunnel entrance. 2 signatures. 2, Calloway said. One of them is Nolan. The room reconfigured itself in Kieran's mind. Nolan knew about this building. He had given Calloway the address, and Calloway's network was compromised to an unknown degree. He had walked them here himself. How long? Kieran said. They're at the tunnel door. It's a reinforced entry. Maybe 4 minutes. One is Nolan, Calloway said. Who's the second? The operator zoomed the feed. The second figure was larger, moving with the deliberate economy of someone trained for exactly this. Gray at the temples. Even in the low-resolution tunnel feed, the scar through the left eyebrow was visible. Rourke Cellon had not sent 8 men. He had come himself with 1. Kieran stood up. Where are the other 8? Topside coverage, Calloway said, already moving. They're not coming in. They're containing the exits. Cellon wants this quiet. He wants the sample, Kieran said. He wants Kaylin. He doesn't want a firefight in a building full of witnesses. He wants the authentication, Calloway corrected. He wants to use it himself, then eliminate everyone who knows what it can do. Kieran looked at the interface on the table. The sample loaded, the connection establishing, the progress indicator showing 30% and moving. How long to complete? He said. At current connection speed? 6 minutes. 4 minutes to the door. 6 minutes to completion. Get Alara and Kaylin to the secondary room, he said to the young woman. The one without exterior walls. Lock it from the inside and do not open it for anything except my voice. He looked at Calloway. Can you keep the connection running without being at the terminal? For 2 minutes, maybe 3. After that, I need to be on the keyboard or it drops. Then you stay on the terminal. He looked at Garrett, who had materialized in the room with the quiet competence that made him valuable. You and I are going to the tunnel door. Garrett looked at him. I'm not a security person. I know, but you know this building better than anyone in it, and that's more useful right now. Kieran picked up the radio from the monitoring station. Let's go. The tunnel was lower than the main floor, accessible through a utility door and a concrete staircase that smelled of old pipe and cold stone. Garrett had the building's internal camera feed on a tablet as they went down, watching the two figures work the entry door with practiced efficiency. They have the access codes, Garrett said, looking at the screen. Someone gave them the entry protocol. Calloway's network, Kieran said. You still trust her. I trust that her 2 colleagues are dead and she's been building toward this for 4 years. That's not a charter asset profile. He looked at the door at the bottom of the stairs, heavy steel, currently locked. That's a person with a reason. The entry tone sounded, a dull electronic click that meant the outer door had been breached. They were in the tunnel. Kieran looked at the door and made a calculation that was not about options. There were no good options, but about angles. Selin was operational. Nolan was operational. In a straight confrontation in a narrow space, without weapons, against 2 trained men, the math was wrong. He looked at Garrett. The water mains for this building, where do they run? Garrett looked at him for a second. Then he pointed at the ceiling. Above the tunnel, secondary line runs along the east wall. Where's the shutoff? There's a valve junction 3 meters to the left of this door. Can it be turned manually? I built this building. Everything in it can be turned manually. Kieran looked at the door. Footsteps in the tunnel now. 2 sets, measured and unhurried. Turn it, he said, and then get back up the stairs. Garrett went to the valve junction. Kieran moved to the side of the door back against the wall, breathing through his nose and keeping the breath even, because when your heart rate exceeded a certain point, your hands got unreliable, and he needed his hands reliable. The valve turned with a sound like a groan. Pipes shifted. A pressure release hissed somewhere above. Garrett went up the stairs without looking back. The door opened. Nolan came through first. He had a weapon out. A compact automatic, held with the familiarity of someone who had carried one professionally for years. He was scanning the space and his eyes landed on Kieran in the same second that the water main above the tunnel ruptured at the weakened junction. The effect was not cinematic. It was 40 liters per minute of pressurized cold water dropping through a corroded joint, hitting the tunnel floor and spreading instantly across the concrete. The electrical conduit along the east wall sparking once and going dark. The overhead lighting dropping to emergency backup that threw everything in harsh red. Nolan slipped. Not down. He was too trained for that. But his footing broke for 1 second, and 1 second was the unit of measurement Kieran was working in. He covered the distance in 3 steps and hit Nolan's gun arm at the wrist with the full torque of his body weight. Not a punch, a structural strike. The kind that didn't require strength so much as angle and commitment. And the gun hit the wet floor and slid. Nolan recovered fast, faster than Kieran's body was ready for. An elbow came back and caught him across the cheekbone, and the pain was bright and immediate, and he tasted copper, and his vision went white at the edges, and he did not stop moving because stopping was the only thing he absolutely could not do. He had Nolan's jacket. He used it. The tunnel wall was concrete and unforgiving, and Nolan's head hit it with a sound that settled the question of whether he was going to keep fighting in the next 30 seconds. He went down. Kieran straightened. Rourke Celan was standing 4 meters back in the tunnel, just past the threshold, and he had not moved. He was watching with the calm of a man who had been in more of these situations than Kieran had had business meetings, and had concluded that waiting was the correct response. He was holding a weapon too. It was pointed at Kieran. The red emergency light threw his scar into hard relief. "You hit harder than I expected," Celan said. His voice was even, accented with something mid-European that had been mostly worn down by years somewhere English-speaking. "Edmund always said you would." Kieran stood in 6 inches of running water with blood in his mouth and his hands at his sides and his breathing carefully controlled. "My father talked about me," he said. "Often. He was proud of you." Selin said it without irony, which was somehow the worst version of it. He was also afraid of what you'd do if you found out what you'd been built to inherit. He was right to be afraid. He tried to stop you. He tried to dismantle 30 years of architecture with a blood sample and a stolen pendant. Something moved in Selin's face that might have been respect and might have been contempt and was probably both. Edmund was a brilliant man. He was not, ultimately, a ruthless one. That was his limitation. "You're going to tell me ruthlessness is what it takes. I'm going to tell you to step aside." The weapon didn't move. The boy upstairs and what he carries belonged to the Charter. That was true before he was born, and it's true now. Edmund's modifications to the authentication system were clever. They weren't decisive. "We've built a workaround." He paused. "We don't need the sample to access the records. We just need Kalen's presence within range of the biometric scanner. He doesn't need to be conscious." The cold that moved through Kieran at those last 4 words was not fear. It was beyond fear. It was something structural, foundational, the kind of cold that came when the thing you were most afraid of became concrete and immediate and no longer theoretical. He doesn't need to be conscious. "You're not going near him," Kieran said. "I don't need your permission." "No." Kieran held the man's gaze and felt everything in him go very still. "But you need me to step aside, and I'm not going to do that. So you're going to have to shoot me." Salon looked at him. "And if you shoot me," Kieran said, "the noise brings Calloway's people down here in 30 seconds, and you lose the quiet operation you came here for. You lose the window. You lose the sample that's currently uploading to 6 simultaneous recipients unless someone is at that terminal in the next." He glanced at the time on the dead display, calculated 4 minutes. He did not know if 4 minutes was accurate. He did not know if the upload was still running. He was building a frame around what he had and praying that Calloway was still on the keyboard. Salon was still. "You don't know where the terminal is," Kieran said. "Nolan knew the building, but not the internal layout. You came in blind on everything past the tunnel door." He took 1 step forward, water moving around his feet. "And every second you stand here is a second closer to that transmission completing." Something shifted in Salon's face. Minute. Real. Kieran took another step. "If you run right now," he said, "you might make it to the terminal in time. You might stop it." Another step. "Or you stay here and watch everything your charter built for 30 years go out to every federal agency and financial oversight body and journalists that Calloway trusts, and by morning there's nowhere on the planet that's safe for any of you." He was 2 meters away now. The gun was still pointed at his chest and his heart was making a great deal of noise, and the blood from his cheekbone was running down his jaw and dripping into the water, and none of it was as loud as the calculation running in his head. Selin made his decision. He moved. He went right, past Kieran, toward the staircase. Fast, choosing the terminal over the confrontation, which was exactly what Kieran had needed him to choose. Kieran spun and grabbed the back of Salon's jacket with both hands and threw his full weight backward, and they went down together into the water, hard, the floor punishing both of them equally without preference. Selin's weapon discharged once. The sound in the confined tunnel was enormous, physically painful, a pressure wave that rang in Kieran's ears and knocked his vision sideways. The round hit the ceiling and fragments came down like gravel. Selin was stronger, significantly. He had 30 pounds on Kieran and 30 years of operational muscle memory, and he used both. Rolling, getting leverage, getting a forearm across Kieran's throat with a pressure that was immediately and efficiently cutting off blood flow. Kieran had approximately 8 seconds before the pressure on his carotid made conscious resistance impossible. He used them. He did not fight the arm. He reached past it, found Selin's scar with his thumb, the left eyebrow, the old wound, the nerve-dense tissue of healed injury, and pressed, hard, harder than seemed reasonable. Selon's response was involuntary, a half-second flinch, a fractional loosening. Kieran broke the grip, twisted, and drove his elbow into Selon's sternum 3 times in rapid succession with every remaining pound of force he had. The third one did it. Selon's breath went. He didn't go unconscious, Men like Celan didn't go unconscious from a hit to the sternum, but he went down onto his hands and knees in the water, head hanging, pulling air in ragged installments. Kieran got up. His legs were unreliable. He leaned against the wall and let it hold him for a moment, breathing. He picked up Celan's weapon from the water, and the weight of it was unfamiliar in his hand. He had fired weapons at ranges. He had never pointed one at a human being. He pointed it now at the man on his hands and knees in the tunnel water, and understood something about himself that he hadn't known before, which was that he was capable of it, that the line between the man he had been before tonight and the man he was right now had been crossed somewhere in the last 12 hours and was not going to be uncrossed. "Stay down," he said. Celan looked up at him, the gray temples, the scar, the flat operational eyes. "You think this ends here?" Celan said, still breathless, still completely certain. "The charter has 7 members. 6 of them aren't in this city tonight." "I know," Kieran said. "You stop me. You stop one operational thread. The others will—" "I know," Kieran said again. "That's why I need the transmission to complete." He looked at the man on the floor of the tunnel. "How much time do I have?" Celan said nothing. "How much time?" Kieran said, and he let something into his voice that he had been keeping behind a door all night, the full weight of a man who has had enough, who has moved past the point where restraint is a value he's optimizing for. Celan looked at him. "The upload completes in 2 minutes," Celan said, "after which the charter's legal team will have injunctions filed in 3 jurisdictions within 24 hours, and the relevant agencies will have 36 hours of bureaucratic interference that—" Kieran was already moving up the stairs. He took them 3 at a time, wet shoes slipping on the concrete, shoulder hitting the wall at the turn and not stopping, through the utility door and into the main room, and he saw it immediately. Calloway at the terminal, hands on the keyboard, and standing behind her with a weapon at the base of her skull was a man Kieran didn't recognize, a figure who had come through somewhere Calloway's perimeter hadn't covered, and the screen in front of her showed the upload at 91% and a prompt that said, "Abort transmission?" with a cursor blinking in the confirmation field. Calloway's hands were on the keyboard. The man behind her was saying something Kieran couldn't hear because of the ringing in his ears from the tunnel discharge. The young woman who had taken Alara and Kaylin to the secondary room was on the floor near the wall with her hand pressed to her side and her face white, and she was breathing, so Kieran filed her and moved on. Garrett was nowhere visible. Calloway looked at the screen. Her hands were on the keyboard. The cursor was in the confirmation field. The man behind her pressed the weapon harder against her skull and said something, and this time Kieran could hear it. "Type it. Type the abort command." 92%. Kieran raised Celan's weapon. He had never done this. His hands were wet and his cheekbone was swelling and his hearing was damaged, and he had not fired anything more consequential than a range pistol in a controlled environment in his life. The man had not seen him. He was focused entirely on Calloway. "Hey," Kieran said. The man turned. 93%. In the doorway of the secondary room, something moved. A small figure, silent, had opened the door a fraction. The crack of light, the glimpse of gray eyes watching. Kaylin. Watching his father. Kieran held the weapon steady with hands that were not as steady as he needed them to be, and looked at the man across the room and understood that the next 4 seconds were going to determine the shape of everything that came after, and he was terrified in the clean, clarifying way that meant he was completely, entirely alive. 94%. "Step away from her," he said, and his voice came out even, which surprised him. And then it did not surprise him, because Alara had been right. He converted fear into something else. He always had. He had just never done it standing in a room that smelled of wet concrete, with his son watching from a doorway, and 30 years of his family's worst history riding on a progress bar that read 95% and was moving with the indifferent patience of a machine that did not understand what was at stake. The man made his choice. He swung the weapon away from Calloway toward Kieran, and Kieran did not wait to see where it landed. He fired once. The shot hit the man's right shoulder, and the weapon dropped, and the man went sideways into the monitoring station with a crash of equipment and stayed down, conscious, cursing through his teeth, but down and disarmed and no longer the immediate problem. Calloway's hands had not left the keyboard through any of it. 97%. Kieran crossed the room and pulled the downed man's weapon across the floor, away from his reaching hand, and stood over him and looked at Calloway. "How long?" he said. 30 seconds. He looked at the door to the stairwell. Selin was still in the tunnel, still recovering. He had 30 seconds. Garrett came out of a side corridor with a fire extinguisher held like a weapon and looked at the scene with the rapid assessment of a man recalibrating. "The woman by the wall," Kieran said to him. "She needs pressure on that wound." Garrett was already moving. 20 seconds. Kieran looked at the doorway of the secondary room. The crack of light, the gray eyes. "Kaylin," he said, "close the door." The eyes held his for one moment. Then the door closed. 10 seconds. Calloway straightened in her chair. Her shoulders came back. She put both hands flat on the table beside the keyboard and looked at the screen. 5, 4, 3, 2. The screen changed. A single line of text appeared beneath the progress bar. Green, clean, unambiguous. Transmission complete. 6 recipients confirmed. The room was silent except for the man on the floor breathing through his injury and Garrett's quiet instructions to the wounded woman and the distant structural sound of the city outside going about its night. Calloway exhaled. It was the first uncontrolled thing Kieran had seen her do. She turned to look at him. Her face was exhausted and certain, and something that was not quite relief, but was relief's foundation. "It's done," she said. Kieran lowered the weapon. His arm was shaking now that the load was off it, the body finally sending the invoices for everything it had absorbed in the last hour. His cheekbone was swollen, and his ears were still ringing, and his clothes were soaked with tunnel water, and there was blood drying on his jaw. He set the weapon on the table. The secondary room door opened. Alara came out first, then Kaylin, the backpack on one shoulder, the clock in his hands, ticking. The boy looked at his father across the room. The weapon on the table, the blood, the wreckage of the monitoring station, all of it. And he did the thing he always did, which was to take it in completely and come out the other side with the most relevant question. "Did it work?" Kaylin asked. Kieran looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "It worked." Kaylin nodded once. Then he looked at the clock in his hands, checking its face with the focus of a craftsman verifying his work. And the seconds ticked on, even and true, each one exactly the weight it was supposed to be. The federal agencies confirmed receipt of the transmission at 4:17 in the morning. Kieran knew this because Calloway's phone began producing notifications with the regularity of a machine that had been waiting a long time to start working. And she read each one aloud in the flat voice of a person who had imagined this moment so many times that the reality of it had a slightly unreal quality, like a room you've drawn from memory and then finally walked into. 4:17, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, confirmed. 4:18, Interpol Financial Crimes Division, confirmed. 4:19. The journalist, a woman named Audra Solis, whose work had broken 3 previous financial corruption stories of consequence, confirmed receipt and responded with 2 words: publishing tomorrow. 4:21, 2 international oversight bodies, confirmed. Calloway set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat like that for 15 seconds, and nobody in the room said anything, because they all understood what 15 seconds looked like when it was 4 years of a person's life finally putting its weight down. The man Kieran had shot was being attended to by Calloway's people with field medical supplies. The shoulder wound was serious but not fatal. Blood loss significant but controlled. He had not said anything beyond his name, which was Anders, and a demand for legal representation, which was not currently available to him in the basement of a building that did not officially exist. The young woman, her name was Petra, Kieran had finally learned, had a deep laceration along her ribs from the edge of a broken monitoring station panel. Garrett had closed it with butterfly strips from the medical kit, with the steady hands of a man who had done worse things in harder conditions and had simply never mentioned them. She was pale, but upright, and refused the suggestion that she sit down. Rourke Selin was still in the tunnel. Kieran had not forgotten this. He took the weapon from the table. He did not want it, but wanting was not the operating principle tonight. and went back to the utility door and down the stairs. The water in the tunnel had drained to a shallow film across the concrete, cold and dark. The emergency lighting still threw everything in red. Nolan was where he'd left him, conscious now, sitting against the wall with his hands pressed to the back of his head and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has completed the calculation of his situation and found the total catastrophic. Selin was standing. He had his back against the far wall, arms at his sides, and he was watching Kieran come down the stairs with the gray, settled expression of a man who had closed the books on a number of possible outcomes and arrived at the one he had left. He looked, Kieran thought, like the portraits in the East Corridor, like Edmund Vale at 60, if Edmund Vale had spent his life entirely in the dark. "The transmission completed," Kieran said. "I know." "Then you know what the next 72 hours look like for the charter." "Yes." No affect, no argument. "There will be arrests, there will be flight. The financial architecture will be frozen in stages as the agencies work through what they have." He paused. "It will take years to fully prosecute. Some of them will not be prosecuted at all." "That's not the same as winning," Kieran said. "No," Selin agreed. "It isn't." He looked at Kieran with something that was not defeat and was not its opposite either. Something more like the end of a very long calculation. Edmund would have appreciated the architecture of it, using the system's own authentication against itself. He always preferred elegant solutions. "Don't," Kieran said. "Don't what?" "Don't make him into something worth appreciating. He built this. He built you into it. He tried to undo it at the end because he found out about Kalen and it changed his accounting, but that doesn't rehabilitate 30 years. He held the man's gaze. "And it doesn't rehabilitate you." Selin looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They stood in the red-lit water at the bottom of the building, and the city moved above them, indifferent and enormous, and the moment held its shape for as long as it needed to. "There are federal agents on their way to this building," Kieran said. "Calloway made the call 20 minutes ago. You're going to be here when they arrive." Selin said nothing. "Nolan, too." Nolan, from his position against the wall, made a sound, not a protest, something more like the last air going out of something that had already been deflated. Kieran looked at the man who had sat across from him for 6 years, who had handled his security and his confidence and his blind spots with professional competence, who had been feeding everything to the charter for the full duration of that time. "Why?" he said. Not with anger, just the question. Nolan looked up. His face was a mess. The wall had done real work. And his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down in the worst possible place. "They had my sister," Nolan said. "They took her 6 years ago, before I came to you." He stopped. His jaw worked. "They said as long as I delivered, she was fine." "Is she?" "I don't know." His voice broke on it, just once, and then he sealed it back. "I stopped knowing about 2 years in. They wouldn't let me verify. I just kept going because I couldn't stop." Kieran stood in the water and felt the weight of that land in him and tried to do what he believed in doing with true things, which was to receive them honestly, regardless of what they cost. "I'm going to find out what happened to her," he said. Nolan looked at him. "I'm not doing it for you," Kieran said. "I'm doing it because she didn't choose any of this." He paused. "But you still have to answer for what you did. There's no clean version of this for you." Nolan looked at the floor. "I know," he said. "I've known for a long time." Kieran went back up the stairs. The federal agents arrived at 5:40 in the morning. 4 vehicles, 12 agents, with the organized efficiency of people who had been watching the transmission data come in for 90 minutes and had mobilized while they read. The lead agent was a woman named Carver, compact and direct, who shook Calloway's hand with the particular respect of someone who had been told the story and had chosen to believe it before confirming it. Kieran gave his statement in the main room while Ilara sat with Kalen in the secondary room, the door open, the boy finally properly asleep on the cot with his backpack beneath his head and the clock on the floor beside him, ticking. The statement took 40 minutes. Carver listened with a stillness that meant she was recording everything and would be reviewing it for a long time. When he was done, she looked at her notes and said, "Vale Global is going to be under investigation. You understand that?" "Yes." "It could take 2 years. The legitimate operations may survive it. The financial architecture your father built around it almost certainly won't." "I know. You're going to need legal representation that has no prior connection to your family or the company." "I have a name." She nodded. She started to stand and then stopped. "The charter's 6 other members. We have 4 in custody as of 40 minutes ago. The other 2 are in jurisdictions that are cooperating." She met his eyes. "This is going to hold. The documentation is... I've been in financial crimes for 18 years, and I have never seen documentation this complete. Calloway built it over 4 years." "I know. We're going to need her for the prosecution." A pause. "She knew we would. She built for it." After Carver went to process the scene, Kieran sat at the folding table in the main room with a cup of cold coffee that Garrett had produced from somewhere, and he looked at the surface of the table and thought about nothing specific for several minutes. Just the grain of the wood, the ring from a previous cup, the small ordinary texture of a surface that had been here before tonight and would be here after. Garrett came and sat across from him. "Your building," Kieran said. "I'm sorry about the tunnel damage." "The tunnel was already problematic," Garrett said. "The water main was on my list." "I'll cover the repair." "You'll cover the repair," Garrett agreed without dispute. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with the company?" "Rebuild it." Kieran looked at his hands. "The parts that are real, the parts I actually built. There's enough of that. Enough genuine business, enough legitimate structure, that it's worth saving." He paused. "It's going to look different on the other side of the investigation. Smaller, probably. More transparent by necessity." He picked up the cup and set it down again. "Good, maybe. For the first time, actually, good." Garrett looked at him with the expression he used when he was deciding not to say something. "Say it," Kieran said. "Your father wasn't entirely wrong about you," Garrett said. "The part about what you'd do if you found out. He was afraid you'd burn it all down." A beat. "You didn't." "I burned enough." "You burned the parts that needed burning. That's a different skill." Kieran looked at the old wood grain of the table and did not answer, because some things were too close to being true to respond to without more distance. The morning came the way mornings came after long nights. Not dramatically, just incrementally lighter. The darkness thinning in stages until the light was simply there, and the darkness was simply gone. Kieran stood at the narrow window of the main room and watched it happen over the roofline of the adjacent building. He heard Kaylin wake up. Not the sound of it directly. The secondary room door opening. The particular quality of footsteps that belonged to a child who moved carefully in unfamiliar spaces. The boy appeared in the doorway of the main room with the clock in both hands and his hair pressed flat on one side from the cot pillow. He looked at Kieran at the window. "What time is it?" he said. "About 6:30. Kaylin looked at the clock, verified this independently, nodded slightly with the satisfaction of an instrument confirmed accurate. Kieran turned from the window. "Did you sleep?" "Some." The boy came into the room and looked around at the cleared aftermath, the damaged monitoring station, the marks on the floor, the medical supplies that hadn't been put away. He took it in with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. "Is it over?" "The worst of it." "What does that mean?" Kieran looked at his son and considered giving him the version that was edited for age, and concluded that this child had spent the night on the floor of a moving car and in a locked room listening to a gunshot through a wall, and deserved the unedited one. "It means the people who were hunting us are either in custody or running and don't have the resources anymore to organize another operation. It means the information that made you a target is now public, which removes most of the reason for the target." He paused. "There's still going to be legal processes, investigations, things that take a long time and aren't exciting but matter, but the part where men follow us through the city, that part is done." Kaylin absorbed this in the methodical way. "What about Nolan?" "He's in custody." "Was he the one who told them where we were?" "Yes." The boy looked at the clock in his hands. "He seemed like he was on our side." "He thought he was," Kieran said. "It's more complicated than that." Can something be complicated and still be wrong? Yes, Kieran said. Absolutely. Kalen appeared to accept this as a complete answer. He sat down at the folding table and set the clock in front of him and looked at it. My friend Danny has a clock like this, he said. Older, actually, his grandfather's. He can't get it to run right. He turned it to examine the back. I think the mainspring is fatigued. If I had the right tools, I could fix it. When we get somewhere with the right tools, Kieran said, we'll fix it. Kalen looked up at him. Something in the gray eyes shifted. The door from 2 days ago, the one that had opened a fraction over a 30-degree angle, opened a little further. Okay, the boy said. Alara appeared in the doorway of the secondary room. She had slept. Not much, but some. The lines in her face slightly less taut than they had been at 3 in the morning. She was watching the two of them at the table, and her expression was doing the complicated private thing that Kieran was beginning to relearn how to read. She came into the room and poured herself coffee from Garrett's supply and sat down at the table across from Kalen, and the three of them were quiet together for a moment in the early light coming through the narrow window. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was too new for comfortable. It was something more like the first structural test of something recently built. The weight going on for the first time, everything holding, no certainty yet about what it would bear over time, but the immediate result encouraging. We need to talk about school, Alara said. Kalen looked at her. I missed yesterday. You missed yesterday, she agreed. There will need to be an explanation. What kind of explanation? A boring one, Kieran said. Family emergency. Which is true. Kalen considered this. Danny's going to ask questions. Let him ask, Alara said. You don't have to answer all of them. The boy looked between his parents, a word that was still adjusting to its new plural weight, and appeared to make a filing decision about the whole subject, setting it in the category of things that would be handled in order rather than all at once. Garrett came in and said the agents were finishing the scene documentation and would be releasing the building within the hour. He said it the way he said everything, as information provided without editorial, and then went back to supervising the process with the quiet authority of a man on his own ground. They left the building at 8:15 into a morning that was cold and clear. The rain from the previous night dried off the pavement, the sky a flat pale blue that promised nothing and threatened nothing and was simply sky. Carver had arranged a secure vehicle for them, a Vale-adjacent property, not the compromised safe house, but another one from a list that had been vetted by her team overnight. It was in the northeast part of the city, a townhouse in a neighborhood of matching brick facades and mature trees that had been dropping their leaves for 2 weeks and had reached the phase where the pavement was entirely covered in amber and brown. Kalen looked at the leaves from the window of the vehicle. I've never lived somewhere with this many trees, he said. You haven't lived here yet, Alara said. But we're going to? She looked at Kieran. For a while, Kieran said, until we figure out what permanent looks like. Kalen turned back to the window. He watched the trees go past with the attentive focus he brought to mechanical things, cataloging them, noting the varieties, his breath making a small circle of condensation on the glass. The townhouse was clean and furnished and entirely impersonal in the way of places that had been prepared for occupancy rather than lived in. Alara walked through it with the appraising eye of someone who had built a home from nothing before and knew what the bones of a space required. She stood in the kitchen and opened the cabinets and closed them, looked at the window over the sink, which faced east and would get the morning light. It needs things, she said. We'll get them, Kieran said. I mean, the small things, the things that make it feel like somewhere. She turned from the window. A specific coffee mug, the kind of soap that smells right, a plant that you have to remember to water. She paused. Those things take time. We have time, Kieran said. She looked at him with the measuring look that she had been giving him for 3 months every morning across a coffee shop counter, and that he was only now beginning to understand the full content of, not suspicion, not quite hope, but the careful preliminary work of someone who had been hurt at the structural level and was testing load before committing weight. Do we? She said. Not a challenge. An actual question. The investigation is going to take 2 years, he said. Maybe more. I'm going to be rebuilding Vale Global into something I can actually stand behind. I'm going to be untangling 30 years of my father's architecture, piece by piece. He held her gaze. I'm going to be learning what it means to have a son. All of that is going to happen here, in this city, in this building, or one like it. He paused. So yes, we have time. Alara looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window and the morning light and the east-facing view that would be something to look at while coffee was made. I'm going to need a new coffee shop, she said. I know. Not a franchise, not somewhere corporate. Her voice had something in it that was almost dry, almost the edge of the humor he remembered. Somewhere with bad signage and good beans and a corner table with a wobbly leg. I'll look for one, Kieran said. You don't need to look. You'll walk past it one morning and you'll know. She glanced at him over her shoulder. That's how it works. He stood in the kitchen of the impersonal townhouse and felt the weight of 3 months of morning coffee shift in his chest. All those 6:15 arrivals, the corner table, the overhead lights, and the counter, and her back turned. The whole careful architecture of two people circling something they couldn't yet name, and understood it for what it had been, which was not accident and not fate, but simply the oldest human impulse, which was to return to what mattered without being able to say why until the returning was already done. Kaylin found a table in the small back room off the kitchen that wobbled on its third leg, and within 20 minutes of arriving had shimmied it level with a folded piece of cardboard from one of the supply boxes, and had then apparently decided this was his workspace, because he set the clock on it and opened his backpack and got out the small toolkit he carried everywhere and went back to work on a secondary project Kieran hadn't seen before. A disassembled bicycle derailleur that he'd apparently been carrying in a side pocket for reasons he didn't explain. Kieran stood in the doorway and watched him work. The morning light from the east window fell across the table at an angle that lit the boy's hands and the small, precise movements of them, turning components, testing tension, checking alignment with the focused patience of someone for whom the work itself was the point. He thought about what Alara had said, that he took things apart to see how they worked, that he always put them back together correctly, that he had never broken anything that wasn't already broken. He thought about the clock on the table ticking with its corrected escapement, each second even and true, and a derailleur being reassembled with care, and a life that had been taken apart by people with agendas and bad intentions being put back together piece by piece in a brick townhouse in the northeast part of a city that was going to be, for a while, home. He thought about his father's portrait, the gray eyes, the long, unbroken line of men who had built their legacies on foundations they'd chosen to stop examining. He thought about Kaylin's hands, which were his hands, his father's hands, his grandfather's hands, and what those hands were doing with them, which was to fix something that had been broken, carefully, without forcing it. The line did not have to mean what it had always meant. That was not a given. That was a choice, made in the specific, daily, unglamorous way that all real choices were made. Not in tunnels with weapons, not in the moment of maximum stakes, but in the ordinary morning light with coffee on the stove and the patient work of reassembly going forward one component at a time. The first media coverage broke at 9:47 that morning, Audra Solis's piece going live with a headline that ran across every financial news aggregator within the hour. By noon, 2 of the charter's confirmed members had issued statements through lawyers. By mid-afternoon, the financial markets in 3 countries had registered the kind of tremors that came from institutional certainty, suddenly becoming institutional uncertainty. Kieran read the coverage on his phone at the kitchen table, while Alara made coffee in the east-facing kitchen with the temporary equipment they'd found in the supply stock. He read it with the particular attention of a man seeing the shape of the next 2 years of his life laid out in real time. The questions he would be asked, the records he would have to open, the full accounting of what his name had been attached to without his knowledge, and what it was going to cost to separate the real from the inherited. It was going to cost a great deal. He was going to pay it. He set the phone face down on the table. Alara set a cup in front of him. Dark, slightly bitter, with that particular weight that came from something properly made. She sat down across from him with her own cup and wrapped both hands around it, the long fingers, the small scar at the base of the left thumb, and looked at him across the table. "How bad is it?" she said. "It's bad." He picked up the cup. "It's manageable." "Those aren't the same thing." "No, but they can coexist." He drank the coffee, and it was, despite everything, exactly right. He looked at her across the table. "You made this from the supply stock." There was a bag in the back of the cabinet. Guatemala. The edge of something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, not its absence. "I know how you take it." He looked at her. The morning light in the kitchen, the impersonal walls that were going to become, gradually, something else. The sound of the clock from the back room, ticking through the doorway, steady and even. "Alara," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say, and I'm saying don't. Not because it's wrong, but because it's too soon for the words." She held his gaze. "We have time. You said so yourself." He held the cup. He looked at her. "Okay," he said. She looked at him a moment longer and then looked at the window. At the morning outside, at the leaves on the pavement catching the light. From the back room, Kaylin called out, "The derailleur's done. Can someone find me a bicycle to put it on?" Alara closed her eyes briefly. "Where is he going to get a bicycle?" "I'll find one," Kieran said. "Of course you will." She looked back at the window. "You're going to spoil him. I have 8 years to make up for." "That's not how it works." "I know how it works," he said. "I'm going to do it anyway." She looked at him then with the look that had no performance in it, no guard, no wall. Just the face of a woman who had carried something enormous for 8 years alone and was very slowly learning to set it down. "Okay," she said. Just that. The same word his son used when he had made his decision and was moving forward. Outside, the city went about its morning. The light moved across the pavement the way light moved, without agenda, without memory, the same for everyone it touched. The leaves came down from the mature trees one or two at a time in the small wind off the river, amber and brown, landing where they landed. In the back room, a boy with gray eyes in his father's hands and his mother's instinct for survival wound a small clock and listened to it tick and waited with the long patience of a child who had always known, in some way he could not have articulated, that the man at the corner table was going to find his way to the back door eventually. The seconds passed, even, measured, each one exactly the weight it was supposed to be. The family sat in the morning light and let them.